Okay guys, and what we want to do in this video, which is most likely the final video of the circular flow of income, we want to complete the model, and we want to ask a few questions about how government can get involved. Okay, so again, I must stress, we're talking about national income, we're talking about macroeconomics, the economy as a whole, and what we're trying to do is develop a very early and rudimentary model that we can use to analyse the economy and think about how a change in spending can affect other macroeconomic variables. So kind of just to start from the start and build the whole thing up from scratch, we said that we had Irish firms and Irish households. They were the only two groups in the economy. And what Irish households did was spend their money on the output, on the stuff. They bought stuff off shops, of firms, of Irish firms, and then Irish firms would then put that money back into the Irish households because the Irish households, or the households in general, own the firms. Then we also said was, well, households don't spend all of their money. What they actually can do is not spend some of their money on Irish firms' output, and they could save it. But then we said that that comes back into the circular flow of income. That comes back to Irish firms, particularly if there isn't a recession and financial institutions are lending in the form of investment. Okay, so that's another thing that's very important there, right? So savings reduces the incentive for Irish firms to produce, lowering national income, lowering employment, and investment increases the demand for the output of Irish firms, increasing output, increasing employment, increasing national income. We also said was that even if Irish households do spend all of their money, they don't necessarily spend it all on Irish produced goods and services. So instead of this kind of injection of money into the Irish firms, what we see is that some money from Irish households can go to foreign firms, okay, and increase their incentive to produce goods and services. And that's what we refer to as imports. Then also, however, though, people in other countries can buy the goods and services, or at least some of the goods and services that we produce, and we call those exports. Now, the final kind of player in the circular flow of income is one that is very difficult to get away from in this life, and that is essentially the government. Now, what we are saying is that Irish households don't get to keep all of the money that they earn. The government will take some of that in taxation, and the definition of taxation is a contribution required from households and firms in order to finance the running of the country. But the government tends not to just keep all of that money. The government is supposed to use that money to make your and my lives better. And so what they do is they spend that sometimes on the direct provision of goods and services if they build themselves government housing, or other times they could subsidise firms in the economy, in general a large market of course, we're talking about macroeconomics, to produce goods and services for people that may require them. So basically what we're saying is that the way that government influences the economy is through taxation and spending. Taxes, they reduce what is called disposable income. Disposable income is your income minus taxation. That's how much you get to spend. Well, if they reduce the amount that households can spend, well, that certainly will reduce the amount that they can spend on the output of Irish firms. However, the story doesn't end there. What they actually do with that money is then turn around, and invariably, doesn't always have to be, of course, because like this diagram can be far more complex, and I'm keeping it as simple as possible. I think it's very important to do. I have seen wonderful people online go into much greater detail, and I don't know, I'm not convinced that the extra detail leads to greater understanding. In fact, I think it leads to greater confusion. So hence I've tried to keep this simple. So what we are saying is that the government can then turn around and spend some of our taxes on in Irish firms, or on the output of domestic firms, and as such cause them to increase their output, to increase the demand for their goods and services, causing them to increase their output, causing them to employ more workers, causing them to produce more, and as such, if enough firms do that, then that's an increase in national income. So as always, I would ask you to draw the diagram as is, okay? okay? And pause it here, draw this, and then like the rest of the videos on circular flow of income, once you've finished drawing that diagram, what I would like you to do is go down to the questions that follow. So there's a list of questions here. So draw the diagram on the previous page and have a look at these questions, see if you can answer them, and then once you have answers, press play and I'll go through my opinion on them. Okay, so I hope you've had a chance to answer those questions. So what I'm just going to do is go through them one by one as always. Okay, so how can the government influence an economy? All right, a very short answer is through taxation and spending. Essentially, that's what we call fiscal policy, FISCAL policy. Okay, so let's delve deeper into that, okay? So if the government increases spending, how does this affect the economy? All right, well, an increase in government spending increases the flow of money to domestic firms, increases the demand for goods and services produced by these domestic firms. So if the demand for them increases, they have an incentive to meet that increased demand in order to try and achieve higher profits. But this, we're not just talking about one firm or a group of firms. What we're trying to say is that one way the government can influence the entire economy is by just spending more money on the output of domestic firms. That will cause them to produce more. How will they produce more? Well, they'll try and hire more people. Okay, if they produce more and if enough firms produce more, then what we have is an increase in national income. Okay, if the government reduces spending, how does this affect the economy? A reduction of government spending reduces the flow of money to domestic firms. It reduces the demand for the goods and services that they produce. If there is a reduction in government spending and that leads to a reduction in demand, well then firms will reduce the amount of goods and services that they produce. If that happens, well then what happens to national income? Well, if enough firms do that, then national income will fall. Okay, so all we're saying is if less is produced in the economy, brought about by a reduction in aggregate demand, total demand for all domestically produced goods, well then national income will fall. So they're the first three questions on the previous slide. Questions 4 and 5. If government increases taxes, how does this affect the economy? Well, a general way of looking at this is that, and I suppose maybe a better question would be how does it affect national income, like for the previous ones? An increase in taxation reduces the flow of money to domestic firms. Why? Because if you take more money off households, and if you take more money off firms, households are less able to demand goods and services from firms, and then firms are less able to pay other firms. They can't afford it because all of their money's been taken in corporation tax or corporate taxes. So therefore, the total demand for goods and services falls. Why? Where has that demand gone? Well, it's gone into the government coffers. Okay, that demand represented by money has gone into the government account. And therefore, people and firms can afford to buy less off other firms. So if the demand for goods and services falls because households and firms have less money as a result of an increase in taxation, well then what will occur is they'll produce less. And if they produce less, that's the definition. If firms in the economy produce less goods and services, that's the definition of a fall in national income. Okay? And if the government reduces taxes, well then the opposite is true. Well then households have more money, they're richer. Okay, firms don't have to pay as much corporation tax. They can afford to engage in more investment projects. So a reduction in taxation increases the flow of money to domestic firms. And what that means is that there's an increase in demand for what they are producing. If that happens as a result of a higher disposable income, well then what that means is that firms have a profit incentive, all firms have a profit incentive in order to try to meet this increase in demand. And what will they do? Well, they will produce more goods and services, usually by employing more factors of production. In this case, what we're talking about or have been talking about is labour. And employment will rise, more goods and services will be produced to meet that higher demand, and as such, national income rises. So that's the whole idea of this idea of circular flow of income, which is that if you allow more, now I'm not just talking about printing money, we'll talk about that when we come to monetary policy, but I'm just saying if you allow people to buy more off domestic firms, if aggregate demand increases for the output of domestic firms, if people want to buy more goods and services at different price levels from domestic firms, well then they will react by trying to meet that increased demand. And that means they have to produce more and more goods and services. And that, by its definition, is an increase in real GDP. If, on the other hand, government, through increased taxation or reduction in government spending, reduces the aggregate demand in the economy for the output of domestic firms, well, they will also react to that reduced demand by reducing the amount that they produce, which in and of itself is the definition of a reduction in real national income, in real GDP, in real Y. Okay? Y, I mean the letter Y, capital letter Y, standing for income in economics. So, what I have done here is kind of given you three, potential effects of an increase in aggregate demand in general, in the demand for domestically produced goods. So name two likely effects of the government both increasing spending and reducing taxes. Well, that's a double-edged sword, because they're increasing the demand for domestically produced goods and services, and they're also increasing the disposable income of households, which in turn, as a result that they're richer, that means that they can spend more money on the output of domestic firms. So, therefore, the demand for goods and services, aggregate demand in the economy rises. The demand for domestically produced goods and services has increased. Well, what do firms do? Well, they try to meet that increase in aggregate demand simply because they have a profit incentive to do so. Well, how do they do that? Well, they increase employment. If employment increases, what happens to national income? Well, more factors of production are being used. So therefore, they're going to make more stuff, so national income rises. Now, also you have to think about this. If there's an increase in demand in general for all goods and services, if every shop owner sees that people want to buy more and more of their goods and services, what would they do with their prices? And most likely they would increase them. And that's what an increase in inflation is, an increase in or sustained increase in the general level of price, not just the price of one good, but the price of all goods in the economy. That's what inflation is. When the price of all goods on average in the economy rises, that's what inflation is. And where could the government get the revenue to increase spending if it cannot raise taxes? So if it's reducing taxes and increasing spending, well, what they're going to have to do is borrow it. That's going to cause an increase in the national debt, okay? The combined deficits of previous governments, all right? And what that's going to do is that's going to cause aggregate demand to increase. And where should they get that money from? Well, preferably from abroad. And when we're studying fiscal policy, we'll see that there's this thing called the crowding out effect, and we'll see that the government should never try to cause that to happen. So if they could borrow from banks abroad, that wouldn't affect the demand and supply for investment goods, or for loanable funds in the domestic economy. Now, please do not concern yourself if 6 and 7 don't make sense to you yet. All I'm just saying to you right now is that I want to kind of shape your thinking in the future, that an increase in the demand for everything most likely will increase employment, most likely will increase national income, most likely will increase inflation. Doesn't always happen and doesn't always have to happen, or at least all of them at the one time. But what we will see later on is a better, more complete model called the aggregate demand, aggregate supply curves, where we can analyse what would happen and why at different stages of production and different government interventions. Guys, thank you so much for watching. Before I let you go, there is one final thing that I really need to bring in to your attention. If we look at the circular flow of income diagram, we have seen that savings, imports and taxes, all of those cause less money to go from Irish households to Irish firms. All of those reduce what is called aggregate demand, the total demand for domestically produced goods and services, the total demand, the total spending on the output of Irish firms. All of those cause that to reduce. All of those, therefore, at least should or most likely would lead to a reduction in national income, because they are reducing the demand for domestically produced goods, and that means that the Irish firms won't have the incentive to produce as much as they would. They would reduce the amount that they produce, and as such cause national income to fall, because a reduction in total countrywide production is, by definition, a fall in national income. For that reason, these are seen to be leakages out of the domestic economy. A leakage is any situation or any payment that is not spent in the domestic economy. Okay, because taxes aren't spent. I know that we'll come to that side in a second. But savings aren't spent. That is literally the definitions of saving, that portion of income which is not spent. Imports are not spent in the domestic economy. They are spent, but they're not spent in the domestic economy. And taxes aren't spent. Okay? But if we look at the the left-hand side, I do apologize. All of these, investment, the production or purchase of capital goods, exports, the demand for domestically produced goods by foreigners, and government spending, any spending by the government on current and capital projects. All of those three things, boom, increase the demand for Irish produced goods and services, increase the demand for domestically produced goods and services. That will give them an increased incentive. Essentially, these increase aggregate demand and these reduce aggregate demand. Leakages reduce aggregate demand, reduce the incentive for production from domestic firms, and as such have a tendency to cause national income to fall. And injections increase in aggregate demand, increase the demand for domestically produced goods and services, and as such provide an incentive for total production or national income to rise. I really, really hope that makes sense, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again in the next video.